students still can spend their whole time in the States without making an American friend or entering an American home. And I think in a big American city, that's even more true.
You are listening to Our Urban Voices with Dr. Alphonse Javed, a podcast that presents Christian narratives through diverse voices that impact urban ministry. Here is your host.
Hello and welcome back to our Urban Voices. I'm your host, Dr. Alphonse Javed, and today I am joined by Elizabeth Wolf, a campus minister to international students. Our topic today focuses on student ministry, especially to Muslim students. According to Pew Research Center, in recent years, there has been about 1 million international students in the U.S., except for the 2020 to 2021 academic year when international travel declined. A little more about our guest, Elizabeth. She is a small town girl doing ministry in a big city as campus minister to international students. She's been passionate about unreached people group since college and went overseas for a year in pursuit of Bible translation. It was there that God got a hold of her heart toward Muslims, which is the last thing she expected. She is still on a learning curve with the incarnational ministry to students, but is excited for what God has in store. Thanks for joining us today, Elizabeth. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be a part of this.
So, before we get started, please tell us very briefly about your family. I believe family is so important because it helps to humanize us as people and as ministers of the gospel.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much for asking that question. So I have at least two generations of Christians behind me. So my grandparents on both sides were Christians, and my parents are believers, and they're still growing in their faith, which I think is awesome. My mom homeschooled me and my two sisters, so we're pretty close knit family. I also have a couple of missionary aunt and uncles, so growing up, I had a category for overseas missions and reaching the unreached. So I think that shaped a lot of who I am.
That's awesome to hear. All right, so let's dive in. Tell us about your spiritual journey. How did you end up doing student ministry, particularly to Muslims?
Yeah, so I have one of those stories with a lot of twists and turns in it. And a lot of it I think probably won't make sense to me maybe until my whole story is written and I'm looking back from eternity. But I came to faith either at 4 or 18. I know that sounds strange, but my mom was sharing the gospel with my older sister, and I learned to read by watching my older sister learn to read. And I was just listening, and I asked Jesus in my heart when I was 4. But when you're 4, it's hard to evaluate
Yeah.
your faith. And the summer after high school, I got really more serious about the Lord because I was about to go on a missions trip with my previous youth group. And we were going to Mexico to build houses. And I just felt like, man, I really need to get my relationship with God in order if I'm going to go do a missions trip. And God really opened my eyes to see myself as an actual sinner, like not just on paper. Yeah, I needed Jesus to die for me, but he really opened my eyes to some specific, like spiritual pride, especially. And I feel like that really launched my growth as a Christian. And on that trip, it was just like a week-long trip, but my youth leader said, I think God's planted a seed in your heart for missions. And I was like, oh, okay. Um, and then in college, I started to realize I wanted to be a missionary. I knew I wanted to be a Bible major, and I kind of landed on Bible translation. And in retrospect, it was a pretty selfish motive. I thought I'd heard all these stories about missionaries going overseas and spending their whole lives there and no one ever coming to faith. And I thought, well, at least if I do Bible translation, I can leave something concrete behind. So it was kind of like a way to like ensure that I had a legacy, which, you could
Right.
argue.
Right.
um, and then I did spend a year overseas pursuing Bible translation. And it was actually there that I got to spend time with a Muslim tribe, and I felt a really deep sense of calling towards Muslims,
Hmm.
which was ironic because I remember in college thinking, okay, I'm pretty much open to whatever field as long as I don't have to work with Muslims. So, so yeah, and then how I got into international student ministry is an even longer story, but God connected to me to a colleague that I'd known from a long time back, and she invited me to come check out the ministry, and he just confirmed it in so many ways. So 4 years later, here I am.
Wow. What are some of the biggest challenges facing students in general and Muslim students in particular?
Yeah. I think they deal with a lot of stress. They're just really busy. I think that's a challenge for me too, finding times to regularly connect with them, that they're available. I think they're juggling a lot of things in their lives. So they have really demanding coursework. They're trying to make
Mhm.
friends. They're trying to enjoy the US while they're here and all the
Mhm.
tourist attractions. They're trying to make time for their family expectations, or sometimes they're looking for a spouse. And, like any students, they're struggling with procrastination and time management, and they're doing all their studies in usually a second language. So, um, I just think they're just super, super stretched thin. Say for Muslims in particular, some might face discrimination in their city or at school.
Yeah.
Some might struggle to find a faith community where they feel comfortable. Like if they're Shia or Sunni, they might not have both options available. It might be really different from the way that their faith community worked back home. They definitely
Mhm.
miss home and food and family. It's always food that they miss.
Right.
Um, and then I think just the heavy weight of like honoring their family
Mm, mm.
with their careers. I think international students face more pressure with that, and Muslims as well. So, and definitely there's always the struggle with loneliness for sure.
Yeah. Well, they have come to the United States, and there's a lot of money that is put into that to send them here, and they have
Yeah.
to succeed
Yes.
to measure those to meet those expectations. You have to measure up to that standard that your parents or if you've been sent by the government on a government scholarship, all of those things are there. So of course the pressure is going to be there.
Yeah.
Um, so many people like pointing out the major generational differences of Gen Z. Can you tell us, have you seen any truths to those differences and how they affect students' openness to faith and religion? And not just we're not just talking about Muslim students. I'm talking about just in your experience, just general Gen Z population.
Yeah. You know, uh, we did a training a while back as a team on reaching this generation, the Gen Z generation. I think the one thing that definitely stands out to me as ringing true in what I see is the emphasis on authentic experience. So I think it
Mm,
was the way I heard it said was like, this generation doesn't care as much about having a cohesive worldview.
mm,
So with apologetics, they're like not as motivated to engage. I mean, definitely still some are, but they're just really desiring something real. So I think there's two ways that provides opportunities to talk about faith and religion. I think when you can be a vulnerable, genuine person who's willing to invest in an authentic relationship, that can go a long way. And when they see that you have a real relationship with God, they are more drawn to you. And then another thing is if you can provide opportunities for them to experience the presence of Christ. So before they come to faith. So that's through answered prayer. If they participate in a worship service, and they see God making an actual difference in their lives, that can be really attractive. So I would say that's true across the board. They're looking for authenticity and experience. Um, and as
mm,
far as that goes with Muslims, I'm finding I don't know if this is just because I work with female students, more than men, but I'm finding that praying through their and talking through their felt needs is more effective than apologetics like the Bible versus Quran kind of thing.
Mm,
Yeah, and so I don't know if that's a generational thing or just maybe a gender difference. I know that my colleagues who work with guys, like they're very interested in like wrestling through things apologetics or like looking at the Bible and looking at the Quran. I just haven't found that level of like intensity with the girls. So yeah.
yeah. Well, I was, I'm a pastor, so we are reflecting on the life of, not life of Paul, but in Galatians chapter, you know, 4
Uh-huh.
verses 12 through 20. Finally, he comes to that point where he's talking about his relationship with the Galatians. This is a community that came to Christ, and now they are reverting back to work-based salvation. So he gives them argument, apologetic, or in Paul's case, doctrinal and theological arguments, and then finally appeals to their relationship. And I think that's what it comes down to. We talking about 2,000 years ago, that was the case, and it has
Yeah.
not changed. I think relationship speak to hearts, where apologetics and other things, theological and doctrinal um, arguments may appeal to their brains and intellect, but they may not go deeper into their hearts. So I agree. It might be, both, something
Yeah.
that is more prevalent now in this generation, but it's not something that's uncommon. It's been there.
Yeah.
It's been the case. So does loneliness become a big issue for international students who may not be able to return home during school breaks?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hit and miss. I feel like it's an unpredictable thing what they end up doing for their breaks. A lot of students, like some of these students have a lot of disposable income, some do not,
Hmm.
but a lot of them will just go on a gigantic road trip on their break, or they'll check out another city somewhere in the US, or they'll, go to the beach. It's like a chance for them to go exploring. And I think that's less of a lonely thing for them. It's more just an adventure time. But for the ones who do stay behind, I definitely think they can be lonely during school breaks. But I'd also say there's just a lot of loneliness throughout the semester as well. Like, if you live in a big city, if you're not in a dorm, if you're just in an apartment with like you don't connect with your roommates, you haven't found your community. Um, it it can just be, and I think the stress, like when most of your time is devoted to studying, like you can really feel alone. You can really feel like just a number, even throughout the semester.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I came as a international student, and some time ago,
Yeah.
and I think it was same. Around the holidays, especially around
Mm,
holidays, there is this aspect of loneliness, and I often find it is a good time for a Christian community to show love and host these folks. But from your experience, do you think international students would be offended or would welcome an invitation to a someone's home, even though the celebration may be around a holiday that is not part of their own religious traditions?
yeah, I would say on the whole, like definitely not. I mean, there might be one person in 100 that is going to take offense to that, but we just had a Christmas cookie party at at a volunteer's home, like an older lady's home. And I think most of the students that came to that were Muslims. We read through parts of the birth narratives of the gospel. And they'd never like, I was a little nervous about it. I was like, I wonder how they're gonna take that. But like, we just kind of asked them, hey, had you ever read that through that before? And they were like, no. And we had a really great discussion about that. I think, I mean, the Quran talks about Mary, and a lot of Muslims have a really warm place in their hearts for her, but their narrative is so different, so it can really spark some great conversations. I mean, I think about it like if I were to go over to, Egypt during Ramadan, most, I think, Egyptian families would want me to come over to their house and experience, the dinner that happens after fasting. Um, and they wouldn't necessarily expect that I'm a Muslim, but they would expect me to want to participate in that. And so I think if you think of it as like a cultural exchange, um, and not to be a bait and switch, like let them know if you're going to plan to read scripture or sing Christmas songs or something like that. And let them decline to participate in anything they're not comfortable with, make sure the food, there's no pork, make sure that they know what's in the food.
Sure.
But yeah, I would say just like invite them and treat them like family. And that's going to cover a multitude of mistakes, it's going to overcome a multitude of cultural barriers, I think.
If someone been around church circles long enough, they may have heard the story about Saudi student coming to America with a suitcase full of gifts to give to all of the people who would invite him to their home. But no one invited him, and he brought all of those gifts back with him. This story is
Yeah.
almost cliche, but based on your experience, is this story rooted in truth?
It's funny. Actually, that reminds me of like a story kind of with the flip side. I had a Saudi student and I was with her when she was about to go back home, and she spent almost like a week and filled up a whole suitcase with gifts, you know, like expensive gifts for like so many different extended family members. So I definitely think culturally that makes a lot of sense. I haven't quite seen that scenario. But the concept definitely rings true. Like, students still can spend their whole time in the States without making an American friend or entering an American home. And I think in a big American city, that's even more true. And if you think about it, they're coming from such a warm, hospitable culture to like a colder culture with a isolating city experience. So I definitely think that is true. And I think it's a huge missed opportunity for Christians. God's bringing these students all the way around the world and they're hungry for community and like I think as the world gets more globalized, they're less and less concerned to making an American friend than they used to be. Uh but I'd still say a lot of students would really just welcome that opportunity to be in an American home and to make an American friend for sure.
Yeah, I often think about that. When what kind of impression um, these students have, what kind of American Christian impression they have,
Yeah.
because we don't act, we don't. So there's Americans, and then there's the American Christians
Yes.
um, community. So those two are we have to show them there's a difference between both of
Yeah.
those lifestyles. Anyways, another issue that often I see among international community or students in general is the issue of mental health. So mental
Mhm.
health is a very big topic for students. Can you share how faith ties into that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a huge concern for students. Yeah, at the college I'm at, there's lots of resources for mental health, and yet I feel like it can be really hard because, in an international in their home countries, there might be a stigma associated with getting help, or they might not trust the methods of the like mental health care professionals in the US. And I also think there's just maybe a tendency to in their faith community or in their cultural background to just put up a good front, like you have it all together, and then to deal more privately with your struggles. And like even I mean it definitely depends from to community, but like even even there might not be a safe place to ask questions, like ask big, difficult questions, like to talk about, hey, I'm depressed or I have anxiety, and how does that work with my faith? And or like, I don't feel like my faith is addressing these problems, and you're just not necessarily allowed or welcome to be that honest. Um, yeah, and on the flip side, a secular university is really pushing like mindfulness and meditation really hard. And some of those practices are benign and some of them can lead you down a dark path. And so it's like it can just be a really confusing world for them to navigate. So I think there's some opportunities to talk about faith, maybe in two ways. Talk about, like, I didn't come from a Christian background where we had a lot of quote unquote spiritual practices, like I basically just read my Bible and prayed every day. But I think as an adult in a different context, I've learned a lot about the value of silence and Sabbath. And we do have a rich history of meditation. It's just meditating on scripture, or even just listening to worship, like all those things I do now for my own mental health. And so I can share that with them, like that I experience the peace and the joy of Jesus in these practices. And a lot of them are things that they can dip their foot in, and it might open up a door for God to communicate with them about his son. Um, and then I think secondly, just like any real friendship, it's the scary things that we're going through, the big feelings that we don't know how to process that actually, if you can share that in a safe space, it really does deepen your relationship. And it can, if you're a safe person and you're not going to judge them and you're going to listen and then you're going to help them think through what they're going through. And then, when they trust you, if you can point them to Jesus, I think can't really ask for a better way to meet them where they're at. And it's a way for like, a lot of times I'll talk about the prophets, the Old Testament prophets, and how honest and vulnerable and open they were with God
Right,
about
right.
how they felt. So I think,
And I also think that the problem of mental health is not something people out there, like international students, struggle
yeah,
with and are unable to talk about it. It's same thing here too,
yeah,
in the United States. And we are, when it comes to advancement, we are way advanced in that area. It's been here, mental health professional, been working here for some time, and we
yeah,
are leading in that area and at some extent, and yet we struggle to open up. It's
yeah,
still the stigma that, oh, like he's mentally not healthy. That's the idea, is so primitive now. But
yeah,
but it's true that they consider you are, you're not mentally well. You're not
yeah,
mentally well, and that is, it's not seen as like, okay, yeah, just like a health, bodily health. The rest of your body needs. You need a healthy body. You need a healthy mind too. And it's all not always that it's cancerous thing. Sometimes
yeah,
a simple thing as, oh, I got a cut. If there's a small cut on your hand, is gonna hurt, still hurt. So it's still bodily health that you're talking about. If it get infected, you're gonna get even worse impact of that. So
yeah,
mental health is a difficult topic, even still here, for people to open up and be honest and vulnerable. It's just still, I think, it's pretty new.
yeah.
Well, let me take you to the next question. What commonly held beliefs about student ministry, if any, do you passionately disagree with?
I think so far for me, all the stereotypes I can think of have been true.
Uh,
So yeah, I mean, like the whole thing about scheduling is really challenging. Yeah. And like appointments falling through, those definitely
yeah,
happen a lot. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I need to think of some more stereotypes and then decide if I think they're true. But yeah.
yeah. What are the ways that someone listening to this podcast, this conversation, could reach out to an international student? What is the first step?
I think just any ways you can think of to be a friend. Um, like I think of, especially with a Muslim student, I think it's okay if you first meet them to just invite them over to your house or invite yourself over to their house. And if you
Hmm.
don't feel comfortable doing that, go out for a meal. Say, hey, do you have a good restaurant that you recommend? And then go out to eat with them. And maybe people need a first step to just meet an international student.
Yeah, yeah. Right, right. You're
I
right.
think if that's the case, like write down your top universities in your town and then do some Googling on whether there's a campus ministry there. There's some really wonderful organizations that work specifically with international students. So Bridges International, InterVarsity sometimes has an international arm, International Friends or IFI, and International Students Incorporated. Those are just a handful, but if you could go to those organizational websites and contact them and say, hey, I'd really love to connect with internationals. They should be able to connect you with someone who's local. And a lot of times, like in our organization, we'll just say, hey, come and see. So it's just a chance to say, hey, come to one of our events and see what it's like, you know? So that's I
Mm.
think those two steps are good ways to get your feet wet.
Wow. Yeah, I agree. And in this way, they will get to experience some love from Christian community, but also we will get to experience some cultural,
Yeah.
new cultural aspect of their life. Before we close out today's episode, is there anything else you would like to add?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this, like uh I've just seen in a lot of different contexts when it comes to Muslim ministry, one of the enemy's favorite tactics, I think, is to if you're interested in reaching Muslims, if you're starting out or if you're trying or if you've been doing it for 10 years, one of his tactics is to isolate and intimidate.
Hmm.
So, he just tells you that you're terrible at this, you're a weirdo, you're the only one in your community who cares about Muslims, maybe. Or you should quit because it's either really hard and really intimidating, or you're going to be bad at it. And
Mhm.
just all those strategies I think that he has. And so I would recommend if you find yourself with a heart for Muslims or just some interest, get a buddy that at least would be willing to listen and pray for you. Even better, a community that are all pursuing a Muslim friend at the same time.
Yeah.
And learn to walk in your identity and authority in Christ, because we don't want to be unaware of the enemy's schemes, and he does not want Muslims to come to faith. So just
Mm.
don't be discouraged, and don't beat yourself up, and don't let him beat yourself up, I guess.
Yeah. No, that's such a good advice. And I was thinking about another side of this argument because most of the people who are Muslim are from the East, and most of
Mhm.
those cultures are tribal cultures. That means they're based on communal aspect of life.
Yeah.
They're not individualistic cultures like ours. So when we work as a community, they experience community. Otherwise, when you are individualistic, or individualistic approach is often seen as a suspicious approach, and it
Yeah.
doesn't work well. But if it's a community that allows them to just relax and be part of that, which reminds them their culture too. So I like that aspect. Anyways, Elizabeth, if listeners wants to uh, get in touch with you, would it be best for them to reach out to you through the contact form on our website?
Yeah,
And
that
we
would be
can,
great.
yeah,
Yep.
perfect. And we can pass it on to you later.
Awesome.
Now, and for the last thing, because we talk about heavy topics, and this is, of course, we're talking about students, we're talking about health, mental health, we're
Yeah.
talking about cultural differences and all those things. And in the middle of that, we're also talking about stereotypes too. So I'm sure you got a few jokes there for us. So I would like to ask you to tell us a joke to lighten the mood.
Sure. I'm a big fan of dad jokes, so they might not be laugh out loud jokes, but one of my favorites is okay. What does a nosy pepper do?
What?
They get jalapeno business.
I love it. I'll make a note and I'll tell my son because he
Yep.
likes my dad's joke.
Yep. That's one of my
Thank you
favorites.
so much.
Yep,
Thank you
absolutely.
so much for being on the show again. That was Elizabeth Wolf, campus minister. And thank you to all our listeners. We truly could not do this without you. If you learned something, have a topic suggestion, or would like to leave us feedback, drop us a note at oururbanvoices.com. Be sure to subscribe to the show and leave an honest review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Tune in next week for more honest discussions from diverse voices.
You've been listening to Our Urban Voices with Dr. Alphonse Javed, which presents Christian narratives through diverse voices that impact urban ministry. Please check back for new episodes every week.